All right, here we are. 10 minutes a day reading the Anarchist Handbook by Michael Malice. We're in chapter 6. And chapter 6 is Josiah Warren, From True Civilization and Immediate Necessity and the Last Ground of Hope for Mankind, 1863. So again, this was Josiah Warren, and he had a utopian community, modern times on Long Island. So just think of the context, 1863, that this book exists in. And we're going to be starting off on page 50. Let me move this a little forward so that I can get to my book. All right, here we go. Head down and reading. Bottom of page 50. 18. Adhering closely to the idea of restraining violence as the mission of government or military power, if this sole purpose was instilled into the general mind as an element of education or discipline, no force could be raised to invade any persons or property whatever, and no defense would be necessary. If the Declaration of Independence, or this sacred right of individual sovereignty, had been commonly appreciated a year ago in the, quote, United States, they would not now be disunited. None of the destruction of persons and property which has blackened the past year would have occurred, nor would 1,200,000 citizens now be bent on destroying each other and their families and homes in these states. 20. Every individual would have been, quote, free to entertain any theory of government whatever for himself or herself, and to test it by experiment within equitable limits. An issue would be raised only where this sacred right was denied, or against any who should have undertaken to enforce any theory of government whatever upon any individual against his or her, quote, consent. The frank and honest admission of this, quote, inalienable right would even now change the issue of this present war and carry relief and protection to the invaded or oppressed, and war or resistance to the oppressor only, whether he were found on one side or the other of a geographical line. Mere theorists say that, quote, the laws of nations decide that a state of war between two nations puts all the members of each in hostility to each other, and that, quote, the laws of nations justify us in doing all the harm we can to our enemies. We need no death warrant from, quote, authority against these barbarian theories. The very statement of them becomes their execution. 21. Every person being entitled to sovereignty within his own sphere, there can be, consistently, no limits or exceptions to the title to protection in the legitimate exercise of this sacred right, whether on this side or the other side of the Atlantic, and whether, quote, in a state of war or not. And as soon as we take position for this universal right for all the world, we shall have all the world for us and with us, and no enemies to contend with. Did military men ever think of this? Did governments ever think of it? 22. The whole proper business of government is the restraining offensive encroachments or unnecessary violence to persons and property, or enforcing compensation therefor. But if, in the exercise of this power, we commit any unnecessary violence to any person whatever or to any property, we ourselves have become the aggressors and should be resisted. 23. But who is to decide how much violence is necessary in any given case? We here arrive at the pivot upon which all power now turns for good or evil. This pivot, under formal, exacting, aggressive institutions or constitutions, is the person who decides as to their meaning. If one decides for all, then all, but that one, are perhaps enslaved. If each one's title to sovereignty is admitted, There will be different interpretations, and this freedom to differ will ensure emancipation, safety, repose, even in a political atmosphere. And all the cooperation we ought to expect will come from the coincidence of motives according to the merits of each case as estimated by different minds. Where there is evidence of aggression palpable to all minds, all might cooperate to resist it. And where the case is not clearly made out, there will be more or less hesitation. Two great nations will not then be so very ready to jump at each other's throats when the most cunning lawyers are puzzled to decide which is wrong. 24. Theorize as we may about the interpretation of, quote, the Constitution, every individual does unavoidably measure it and all other words by his own peculiar understanding or conceits, whether he understands himself or not, and should, like General Jackson, recognize the fact, quote, take responsibility of it, and qualify himself to meet its consequences. The full appreciation of this simple but almost unknown fact will neutralize the war element in all verbal controversies, and the binding power of all indefinite words, and place conformity thereto on the voluntary basis. Did any institution makers, except the signers of the, quote, Declaration, ever think of this? 25. It will be asked, what could be accomplished by a military organization if every subordinate were allowed to judge of the propriety of an order before he obeyed it? I answer that nothing could be accomplished that did not commend itself to men educated to understand and trained to respect the rights of persons and property as set forth in the, quote, Declaration of Independence. And that here and here only will be found the long-needed check to the barbarian wantonness that lays towns in ashes and desolates homes and hearts for brutal revenge, or to act office or a little vulgar newspaper notoriety. 26. But what shall ensure propriety of judgment or uniformity or coincidence between the subordinates and the officers? I answer, drill, discipline, of mind as well as of arms and legs, teaching all to realize their true mission. The true object of all their power being clearly defined and made familiar, there would at once be a coincidence unknown before, and but slight chance of dissent when there was good ground for cooperation. 27. No subordination can be more perfect than that of an orchestra, but it is all voluntary. 28. When we are ready to protect any person or property without regard to locality or party, there can be no hostile parties or nations, nothing to betray by treason, nothing to rebel against, no party to desert to. Then whose fault is it that there are persons called, quote, traitors, rebels, and deserters? 29. If it be true that the sole proper function of coercive force is to restrain or repair all unnecessary violence, then the conclusion is inevitable that all penal laws for punishing a crime or an act after it is committed, except so far as they work to compensate the injured party equitably, are themselves criminal. The excuse is that punishment is a, quote, a terror to evildoers. The excuse is that punishment is, quote, a terror to evildoers. But those who punish instead of preventing crime are themselves evildoers, and according to their own theory, they should be punished and terrified. But the theory is false. Consistently carried out, it would depopulate the world. Such are the fogs in which we get astray when we trust ourselves away from first premises and substitute speculative theories in their stead. Had our military been properly educated to know its true function and purpose, Ellsworth would not have been shot for taking down a flag. The shooting of him did not restrain him, nor did the shooting of Mr. Jackson compensate Ellsworth. But it caused Mrs. Jackson to become insane with grief and has spread a hostile spirit to an incalculable extent among millions, which will descend to future generations, all of which originated in the denial to Mr. Jackson of his, quote, inalienable right to choose his own government, which the, quote, Declaration guarantees in explicit terms to everyone. 30. To take down Mr. Jackson's flag was one degree of encroachment, but it was not necessary to shoot Ellsworth for bad manners. Failing to educate him or to prevent him, one party was as much at fault as the other. The barbarian habit of shedding blood for irreparable offenses, quote, as a terror to evildoers, was acted upon in this case. Carried fully out, mutual slaughter would have continued till there would not be a man, woman, or child living upon the earth. 31. Are not these statements perfectly in accordance with the Declaration of Independence, as well as with the teachings of the wisest and best of our species? I invite thought on the subject. I make the assertions not because they are implied in that declaration, but because they are just such as are demanded at this hour as the only possible means of salvation for barbarism. So again, we're going to stop that on page 54. That was chapter 6 from Josiah Warren, True Civilization and Immediate Necessity and the Last Ground of Hope for Mankind. He was an American in 1863, from the physical copy, which you should buy, of the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll see you soon.